Thank you, David, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very honored to be offered the David L. Schindler Fellowship Chair. On the way over in the plane, I was reading his book on the generosity of creation and finding myself very much in companionship with the world and the thought out of which he wrote. And since arriving here, I've also been the beneficiary of great hospitality by the people here in the Institute, which I have received with thanks, given generously and received with thanks. So to my remarks tonight, a couple of years ago, there was an international conference in Maynooth on the future of Christian philosophy. And some of the thoughts that I've been developing, I've continued to develop since then. It's not an easy, you can't predict the future, obviously. There's a beautiful image in Dante, which I like very much, where he talks about those fortune tellers who offer imaginations and visions of future occurrences. It's in the Inferno, of course, and their punishment is to have their heads turned backwards, fixed in place, forever to be looking behind and weeping into the crack of their buttocks. A brilliant image which we should meditate on when we try to be soothsayers in relation to what the future might bring. That said, the notion of christening philosophy has stuck in me, and exactly what it means in our current world today, often said to be the world after the death of God, is a very perplexing question. But something could be said about it if one understands philosophy in certain ways, and if one understands the plural practices of philosophy throughout a very long tradition. The book that I published a few years ago was God Sense from Default Atheism to the Surprise of Revelation. But in some ways I want to talk about a movement that is a little bit different, in the sense that you could claim that there's a movement also from the surprise of revelation through a secularization, let's call it this, to a desacralization of being. And the question is it a leap short or long from desacralization to something like desecration? And I think the question of christening philosophy, indeed christening as such, has to do with whether a new consecration of life itself, certainly, but perhaps even of thinking in philosophical modality is possible. I think it is possible, but the very language that I'm using is extremely strange in the guild of professional philosophers at the moment. Has to be almost, it's outside the box in a certain sense, though. If one has a more generous attitude towards the long tradition of philosophy, and again, its plurivocal practices, it becomes a little less strange, but nevertheless, I think it is perplexing and challenging. So I wanted to, first of all, offer these words of orientation, and then I want to just briefly now talk about how I conceive the companioning relation between philosophy and theology and religion. That notion of companioning has been part of what I've been trying to do in recent years. Finally, in light of these, I want to note how some significant modern philosophers continue to be Christ-haunted. I think this is an interesting notion. Derrida had an article many years ago on the specters of Marx, in which he used the word hauntology 3 times, but his 3 mentions of hauntology generated a bibliography that would fill half a wall in a contemporary philosophy library. But being haunted is a very interesting occurrence, and there are different ways in which one responds to the ghosts that haunt one. So then at the end, I'll just offer a few thoughts on what might it mean to christen thought after the so-called death of God, as putatively announced by Nietzsche, self-named as the philosopher of the Antichrist, indeed self-christened, so to say, as the Antichrist. In some ways, I don't like talking about the death of God because it's become kitschified in the cultural discourse and evacuated of meaning in the way that words like creativity have also been evacuated. But of course, the sense of the divine as entering into actually the extreme kenosis of death itself, and that being central to the Christian understanding of what it means to be divine, is not to be forgotten at all. Okay, so I have, as I say, I wrote a paper a number of years ago, which was a little bit more manageable. I have a paper now which is less manageable, and I'm turning pages, and there are very wise things written on the pages that, being a very vain professor, I pass over with great reluctance. But my apologies to myself for not doing justice to the many things that I have thought. But I'm sure you'll appreciate brevity is the soul of wit, as some Shakespearean character said. Companioning. Let me say something about companioning. I want to note different relations possible between philosophy and Christianity. I want to propose what I call a companioning relation of philosophy and religion theology. There's a pre-Christianity to philosophy, but we live in the wake of a de-Christianizing which flows from an insistence on the freedom of philosophy, understood in terms of a configuration of thought as essentially self-determining. Autonomous thought is to think in and through itself alone. By contrast, whether with respect to thinking or doing, we need to resist the univocal identification of freedom with autonomy. Being free takes form diversely, and even if one form of freedom is autonomy, this may not be the best way of conceiving philosophies being free, or its being freed in its relation generally to religion, and more particularly in relation to Christianity. Now, I stress the word between, but further qualify this as a matter of one of betweening. This is a new twist in my thinking in recent years, instead of just a substantive between, or even an adverbial or a prepositional, betweening as verb, as wording, as relating in a space that allows many opportunities. And I just indicate at the outset that the word between goes back to Old English roots, going back indeed to Germanic roots, betonum, by two, the sense of a two-ness by two, two by two. It's very suggestive once one begins to think about what might be involved in betweening. If the relation of philosophy and religion/theology is at issue here, we can see these two as thresholding on each other. Different betweenings are possible on the threshold. Think again of companioning as a betweening. The companions can turn towards each other, they can turn away from each other, they can touch each other, they can pass together over the threshold. One might carry the other over the threshold, as in the practice of marriage of old. There are many ways of turning towards and turning away. De-Christening philosophy and default atheism enact different ways of turning away. What then of the touching and being touched on the threshold? In some ways of looking at things, there is no threshold. That there is a threshold of betweening I want to defend, but this is not to deny differences. Even given their differences by the threshold, they can also be held together by it. So it's an open space, and let me just see if I'm getting my pages right here. I'm saving the earth, like all of you, and hence I print my papers 2 sides. But unfortunately, my cosmic goodwill can sometimes lead me into confusion, and I turn the page, and it's a page behind or a page ahead. And maybe that's the world we live in at the moment. We're behind ourselves, beyond ourselves. Apologies for sounding a little Heideggerian, but the cocktail hour hasn't come around yet. To begin, one recalls what is said to be the beginning philosophy before Christianity. I refer to the widely accepted view that philosophical logos emerged from religious mythos, and again, this is well known in introductions to philosophy and so on. And normally it's presented as, I would call it a kind of supersessionism. Logos emerges but supersedes mythos. And hey presto, we're off to the races of truly mature rational thinking. I think in the ancient practice of philosophy, there's far more porosity between logos and mythos. And that is not the childhood of philosophy to be overcome by a more mature logical supersessionism. There's something about the mythos that is a companion to logos, and each in their own way potentially can enrich each other, challenge each other, sometimes indeed contradict each other, of course, because companions don't always agree. And even perhaps in disagreement, they can be mutually fertile to each other. Again, a second configuration, again, you can see how this is plurivocal, many, being is said in many senses. This is also said in many senses. The classical configuration of reason and revelation, where philosophical reason is painted as natural, scriptural revelation as supernatural. The image is often of the theological queen and the philosophical ancilla, the sovereign ruler and the handmaid. Subordination is perhaps not the best word for companioning, though again, in this instance, there was permeability across the threshold between philosophy and theology. The permeability coming from this companioning was not always to the fore as a theme, asking mindfulness. One might give words to this permeability in terms of the secret porosity of thinking and praying. Etienne Gilson delicately offered a spousal metaphor of scholasticism as the honeymoon, quotation, the honeymoon of theology. The honeymoon is well behind us in modernity. Modern philosophy rebelled against any ancillary role and sought to erect a guard post on the threshold, on the immanent side of which natural reason might perfect its own self-determination. I would say that in the companioning relation, one participant, no matter from which side, does not queen it or lord it over the ancillary contribution of the other. The relation and the sovereign and the servant is to a degree reversed in the modern definition of philosophy as essentially self-determining. No ancilla is self-determining in the full sense that is here claimed to be the rational desideratum. The servant who becomes the autonomous master overcomes the over-againstness of the two by now claiming a kind of mastery over the erstwhile master or mistress. The servant becomes master of the sovereign queen and stakes its claim to be beyond all ancillary functions. The figure of Gyges in Plato's Republic comes to mind, actually, and how with a ring of invisibility and power he changes from shepherd to tyrant. There are further variations, and again, I don't need to ring them all. The kind of rationalistic scholasticism, in my view, sometimes leads to, first presented as propedeutic to theology, later becomes entrenched in an apartheid of the two, especially when philosophy feels it has the measure of all its others. Claiming to be the measure of its others can itself turn into a claim over against these others. Philosophical reason, no longer companioning, turns in some instances into the debunker of the religious. Again, I think here of Enlightenment reason, and just a reference to Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, where he explicitly singles out religion. He brings religion before the bar of critique and says it incurs a just suspicion if it does not appear or present itself for rational judgment. Such a quasi-forensic judgmentalism is not the demeanor of a genuine companion. Critical reason as judge is a kind of king on the bench, and religion a subordinate to its sovereignty. The critical judge might write in a serpentine way of the conflict of the faculties, but the straight message is hard to hide. The professor of philosophy is king. Once again, this is not a companioning relation. Now, again, I could say more about Hegel, and in a certain sense, he continues something of, I would call it a speculative supersessionism. Again, this is debated by some more pious Hegelians who want to see a benign and pious Hegel himself in the movement from philosophy to religion. But there's no question in my mind that there is something more absolute about his sense of philosophy than any form of religion, including even Christianity as the absolute religion. So it doesn't lend itself to this, what I would call metaxological companioning in the full sense in which I would defend it. One could say more about Kierkegaard as embodying something like a slave revolt in religion against the imperial sovereignty of speculative reason. I bring in the figure of Nietzsche here, and we'll say a little bit more about him shortly. Here, atheist thought enacts a new agon, an aristocratic revolt against the slave revolt sourced in Judaism, fulfilled in Christianity. Again, this is Nietzsche's view of Judaism and Christianity. The great poet of new legislating thought would have some few companions, but there is no companioning with the multitude of saved mediocrities set over against it. Worthy of note here, even if we give a privilege to the poet, the sacred companions, the poetic, sometimes secretly, sometimes timidly, sometimes with self-incurred shame. An interesting question I can only mention would be the relation of agon and companioning. There are modes of agon and companioning empowered by a secret love rather than antagonism. But of course, then secret love, denied, can out itself as overt hatred. I'll return to Nietzsche. As Antichrist, appearances to the contrary as also companioned by Christ. So just to sum up that line of thought, my sense is that in earlier thinkers in the philosophical tradition, the persistent traces of a proximity, indeed a kind of familial intimacy between the philosophical and the religious, is very, very fruitful. This intimacy was more a living option in the ethos of these thinkers. This is not quite true in our own time. If you like, earlier philosophy and religion rubbed against each other. Rubbing can incarnate a gesture of intimacy, becoming perhaps even a caressing. Rubbing against can also mean being irritated with each other. I would say the intimacy could serve as a source for creativity in philosophy and perhaps also in theology. But to avoid rubbing against each other irritably, we might set the two apart into different silos, but then each suffers. Philosophy loses the urgency of ultimacy, religion decays into sentimental effusion, or expires in moralistic platitude, or still it mutates into the fury of a revolutionary dream of secular salvation. The third section here, which I've entitled Christ-Haunted Philosophers, is a pre-Christianity to philosophy, and the earlier Christianizing of philosophy did find much substance in earlier philosophers, allowing a Christian companioning. This was found in Plato, particularly for Augustine, in Aristotle with qualifications for Aquinas, just to mention major figures. If one finds a de-Christianizing of philosophy in the longer arc of modern thought, it is interesting to ask if post-Christian philosophy is itself Christ-haunted, as it might be put. I am thinking about the enigma of Christ for philosophers generally, but also the response to that enigma refracted through the development in modernity of the self-assertion of autonomous thought, with its diminished and diminishing sense of the holy, itself originally and in the end received by and for or honoring and thinking, not self-determined in and through our thought. These things lead in many different directions, but once again, I'll come back to that in a little while as to whether haunting can turn into something more resurrecting, so to say. I want to just offer a brief sampling again here, and in question time, people can pursue some of these suggestions more. Again, it's a sampling. There are many other thinkers that could be talked about, and many different orientations implicit in some of the things that they said. But I was thinking of the figure of Spinoza, for instance, who in current continental philosophy is often taken as the epitome of the philosopher of immanence as such. Deleuze is one of the current celebrated philosophers who particularly is seen as a philosopher of immanence and nothing but immanence. Spinoza's definition of substance, of course, has that self-contained. It's defined in and through itself. So again, you can see even in the very geometrical logic of his ethical system that the self-referring, self-relating dimension is very present in his understanding of reason. But Spinoza does grant a certain exemplary status to Christ. I find this very interesting, a very striking identification of Christ with the philosopher, though how we are to take this is wrapped in hermeneutical complexity. An admiration for Christ is undeniable, and a striking intimacy of God with God acknowledged. And this is just a brief quotation where he says in the theological Tractatus Theologico Politicus, if Moses spoke with God face to face, as a man usually does with a companion, by means of their two bodies, Christ indeed communicated with God mind to mind. Again, that's a sentence that could be reflected on at greater length, but all I'm here just stressing is the acknowledgement of a singular intimacy with God. Though again, it does raise the question when Spinoza talks about Deus sive natura, God or nature, to what extent some of the things that he say are ad captum vulgi, they're intended for the many. And again, a crucial question, I think, in the question of companioning is whether one can pray. Could one pray to Spinoza's God in the more technical sense that is intended by Deus sive natura? So prayer as an intimacy and more, of course, is also very central to what living companioning might mean. In Spinoza, the Enlightenment moralization of the holy and the desacralization of Christ are initially kind enough to give Christ the consolation prize of moral exemplarity. The Christ haunting has not quite reached the pitch of Nietzsche's Antichrist, but it is not without significance that Nietzsche, one senses again, almost to his surprise, later came to appreciate Spinoza as a blood brother. The companionship of Spinoza and this Antichrist might not have been endorsed by Spinoza himself, but I think it's worth reflecting on a changing of the philosophical hagiography between Christ and Spinoza and a contemporary enthusiast of Nietzsche. Again, I'm referring to Deleuze is very much, he channels through Spinoza, he channels through Nietzsche, but he makes a very striking statement, which I find striking anyway, in one particular place where he talks about, he speaks of Spinoza as the Christ of the philosophers. Deleuze allows himself to be haunted by Christ in praising Spinoza as exemplary for the philosophers of immanence. It would be interesting further to reflect on Nietzsche's self-appellation as Antichrist, and yet jolting us in his signing of one of his last mad letters with the name of the Crucified, as well as Dionysus. I'll return to this. The risen Christ passed through doors, but the post-Christian Christ seems to have the power to pass between opposites, porous to the name of the enemy, being all names and no names, a ghost impossible to confine behind the closed door of self-completing philosophy. And just one point on Deleuze. If Spinoza is the Christ of the philosophers, surely this is a compliment to Christ as much as to Spinoza. Compliment in that the high nobility of Christ is called upon and ascribed to Spinoza, and perhaps haunting the hinterlands of the ascription is the holy innocence of the suffering, of the solitary suffering of the one in communion with the ultimate. The mirror in which Spinoza is praised is haunted by the image of Christ. Christ haunts Deleuze, so to say, at one remove. Being post-Christian, no entire escape from Christ is offered. Now again, I have paragraphs here. I think Kant is also Christ haunted, but he sees Christ as perhaps the highest example of moral rectitude. But he's not the Urbild, the paradigm itself, but the Vorbild. He is not the paradigm, but the highest exemplary example of it, so to say. Each of us, so far as we're rational, contain the Urbild of the rational measure in moral philosophy. And it's very interesting to see in the late 18th century how when Kant became a cultural phenomenon in the German-speaking world, many young men wrote their lives of Jesus. Again, you're coming out of a Lutheran tradition, but certainly they tried their hand at a kind of Christo-fiction in which Christ is seated on the mountain and giving his sermon on the Beatitudes, and the Beatitudes are reformulated as variations of the categorical imperative. I find this a genre of comic literature of the highest seriousness in that Germanic sense. Hegel, the young Hegel himself, actually tried his hand at that type of literature. He became a little bit more dialectically complicated and rich as he matured as a philosopher. In the case of Hegel, again, Christ in one sense is very central in his Trinitarian way of thinking, but his Trinitarian thought ultimately is a representation, a Vorstellung of what is more properly articulated in rational terms in his speculative system. Fair enough, there's that, if you like, dialectical speculative supersessionism, but the singular figure of Jesus is merely transitional. Hegel is really interested in the community of spirit, not in the figure of Jesus Christ. And in fact, in places he rails really against, I suppose, his fellow Lutheran Christians, if he is a Lutheran Christian, for fixating, so to say, on the scandalon of the figure of Christ himself. So again, as in Hegel, Hegel claims to give us a system that in one sense illuminates the ultimate equivocities of being, but the very illumination itself hides equivocities that, in my view, actually began to emerge once Hegel himself left the scene and the system was put under pressure and, in a certain sense, allowed possibilities for something like a more conservative Christianity, not necessarily an orthodox Christianity, but also at the same time allowed for a more radical atheism of the sort that Feuerbach and Marx and many others took to be actually the secret meaning of Hegel. And I think, again, the inner equivocation in a dialectic that claims to overcome all equivocation is very much something that is, this is a theme that equivocations can be simple equivocations in the sense of leading to contradictions, and they can be exposed, but there can be camouflaged equivocations in the sense that there is an equivocation, but it's camouflaged in a certain way so you don't really know that it is an equivocation. There can be positive things about equivocations insofar as you're not intent on simply stressing one side over against the other. Like I call them saturated equivocations. They're not too far off from what's entailed by a certain logic of analogy. I think, again, I will be corrected by more philologically literate Thomists, but Thomas does say somewhere to the effect that there is a kind of a tilt possible towards equivocity in the notion of analogy. To my knowledge, again, I don't think he develops it, but equivocity in the saturated sense can be the threshold of a sense of religious mystery that calls us into a deeper exploration of that mystery. Okay, I'm turning my pages. I want to just offer some remarks on Nietzsche. I have a last section where I do talk about christening a bit more directly, and I've passed over reflections on Kierkegaard. You see how it grows and grows. It's a bit like I was thinking of the analogy of, those cupcakes. You cook them, and then there's that thing that comes out over. I write papers, and they don't come just to the brim of the cupcake. They kind of, and of course, sometimes when they flow over the edge, the worry is, of course, that they become formless. But my deeper hope, of course, is that they're full of sweetness and sustenance for those who are willing to take and eat. To offer a few remarks on Nietzsche, because he's in some ways the most interesting, because I do think he's an equivocal philosopher, and he exploits dimensions of equivocation in a manner that is seductive, and at times I think lacking the vaunted self-knowledge that he does claim for himself over and over again. There's more lurking in what Nietzsche says than he himself fully comprehended at times. I recall, for instance, in the Antichrist, where he says of Pilate, he was the only noble character in the New Testament. So, he again, citing what Nietzsche said, he showed the Roman scorn, one Jew more or less, what does it matter? Now, again, that's an issue that I'm quite willing to talk about, but there are lots of kind of exonerations of Nietzsche in relation to the question of the Jews, but it's a much, much more complicated question than the views that are floating around. There was a very good book published about 2016 by a historian called Robert Holub, which I would recommend. It's called Nietzsche's Jewish Problem. And he goes through Nietzsche from a young boy through his time at Basel and coming into the company of the Wagners and afterwards and so on. It's a much more complicated question than just that Nietzsche was he's anti-Semitic in later years. It's much more complicated than that. And then Ecce Homo, the name of his last book, or one of his last books, I think it's an extraordinary name. Again, it's perhaps common in a certain genre of declaring ourselves, but ecce homo is Pilate's declaration on showing the innocent Christ to the crowd. He's the sacrificial victim. There's something deeply thought-provoking, if not disturbing, in that Nietzsche took the title Ecce Homo for his autobiography, that's the right word, placed next to the title of his most violent attack on Christianity, Antichrist. Ecce Homo, referring to himself, makes one wonder who or what is being shown by Nietzsche and to whom. Is Nietzsche Pilate or Christ? Is Nietzsche showing himself to the crowd as Pilate and as Christ, offering himself to the gaze and execration of the crowd, a sacrifice that will divinize the victim? Divine power and kenotic powerlessness, priest and sacrificial victim in one, a kind of counterfeit double of Christ. What else is the Antichrist? Again, this is the fascination of Nietzsche that doesn't go away, though again, in my reading of Nietzsche, these complexities, the only person that I know in recent decades that has tried to penetrate into some of these saturated equivocities is René Girard. He has a sense of something going on here, which I think touches on what's more true. Nietzsche is Christ-haunted, a seemingly odd thing to say, given his assumption of the name Antichrist towards the end of his sanity. Quite to the contrary, there's nothing to be surprised about this. To assume the name Antichrist indicates one cannot define through oneself alone what one purports to be. One is what one is through negation of what one does not want to be. But what one does not want to be haunts one as a ghost that cannot be interred. Or rather, it is interred in the very negation itself, and from the grave in the spirit can be resurrected again. A phrase that I've meditated on elsewhere, that Nietzsche uses in his notebooks. He talks about the Roman Caesar with the soul of Christ, trying to bring together the erotic sovereign and the agapeic servant. This is one expression of it. It's a strangely tortured expression of it, ostensibly announcing a new superiority to Christ, in fact, dependent on a misunderstanding of or malformation of what it would transcend. The threshold is there, and the possibility of a kind of companioning, but on that threshold, the attitude that ruled Nietzsche's agonistic spirit was secret envy. I think, again, Girard has a sense of this. Christ the companion is Christ the competitor. The agon becomes a distorted mimesis out of which I believe counterfeit doubles of agapeic generosity were birthed. I think of Zarathustra's gift-giving virtue, in some ways a very beautiful part of Zarathustra. The gift-giving virtue is a counterfeit double of agapeic generosity. Similarly, the child of Zarathustra is a counterfeit doubling of the child of Jesus. There's no father of Nietzsche's child. It is a self-rolling wheel. Hence, its yes is always a circling around itself, a sacred self-circling. It mirrors eternal recurrence, the cosmic circling that closes the porosity of the cosmos to creating divine transcendence, always more than any whole or imminent circling of being. Nietzsche wanted not to be Christ-haunted, but his exorcism of Christ only serves to call out Christ as inescapable. Okay, I have 7 or 8 pages on Heidegger, but I know I would myself be crucified if I started reading those pages. And I make no claim to be Christ or the Antichrist. But you're all Christians, so you wouldn't do that to me. In a post John Paul II incarnation, if ever this meditation appears in a final form, you have something to look forward to. There's some very interesting things in Heidegger, actually, where I think he evades the figure of Christ. But I leave that for questions, because I know lurking among many Catholic theologians is this secret. The Catholic theologian and philosopher has been secretly seduced by Heidegger. So I want to ask, this is my final, let me see how I'm wasting my time. I'm not too bad. I want to ask if one might christen philosophy after the death of God, as putatively announced by Nietzsche, self-named, as we saw, not only as the philosopher of the Antichrist, not only in the name of the Antichrist, but as the Antichrist. Now, I know there's an equivocation said to be in the Antichrist can mean the anti-Christian or Antichrist, and that's often exploited by those who want to soften Nietzsche's desire to actually get in our face. I think he wants to do that. He wants to provoke us in the extreme. And I think that just simply exploiting that equivocation doesn't do justice to the vehemence of his passion. If a philosopher can quote poetry without shame, and this is Heidegger, why can't a philosopher cite sacred scripture without loss of face? If a thinker can be in conversation with a poet, again, Heidegger, what prohibits a philosopher from companioning or being companioned by religious communications? And this mutatis mutandis, mutandi, in listening unto hearing, even into responding. I fail to see any intrinsic interdiction here, though I am aware of the invisible secular taboo about entering into this prohibited space of sacred betweening. Just a few indications of, in relation to my own work, what this sense of christened philosophy, and again, the deeper connection between some of these things, I really can't do justice to here. But one of the things that has engaged me over the years is pursuing the notion of a consecrated thought. What would consecrated thought be? And I would say the vocational character of thinking is crucial. The vocational is not simply the professional. Say then, we do not think, rather thought comes to us, and our best thoughts come to us, at least initially, from who knows where. We will be impelled to query the whence and also the whither. The question to address mystery emerges itself out of mystery, and never entirely dissolves the companioning mystery. Being consecrated to thought is not the project of a manager, scholar. Projection might try to overtake consecration, management to counterfeit vocation, but there is infidelity to the call of thought in this. Consecration is not something for which one can apply for a grant or subsidy or funding. In another important sense, though, consecration is essentially in the business of being granted to itself. There's a granting that is prior to the relative self-determination of thinking through itself, if it is ever self-determining in a strong sense. I've also spoken of what I call metaxological metaphysics as entailing a second birth of thinking in the dimension of the hyperbolic. Again, apologies for the sometimes technical terms of the overdeterminacy of being, the too muchness of being, beyond indeterminacy, beyond determinate being, and beyond our own self-determination. A second birth, there is a first birth in agapeic astonishment, but there is possible the resurrection of astonishment and perplexity, even at the limit of determinate cognition, even in its tending towards comprehensiveness in reaching to all of determinate being. There's another dimension of thinking born again in what I call metaxological metaphysics. So in other words, even if you had perfect science in the more determinate sense that all the particular sciences are seeking to complete in their own time, this is in a different dimension. It's not adding in that, let's say, quantitative sense to a body of knowledge in that way. It's something different. It's more in the nature of a certain metanoetics of philosophical thought. It's interesting that the word meta is itself double, referring us to what is both in the midst as well as what is above, over and beyond. That doubleness, I think, is very, very important insofar as, like the modern philosophers of immanence, there's no question that we have to be true to what immanence shows to us, but in the midst of things, something hyperbolic to immanence is communicated that can't be fully determined in immanent terms. there is a being reborn of thought from above determinate and self-determining thinking. Again, I bring in the notion of consecrated thought. In christening, there is the offering and the taking up of a new beginning. And I just want to note a number of aspects of relevance of the notion of christening. Christening is the giving of a name offered in sacred baptism, affording initiation into a community, enabling the christened one to be newly porous to the reception of grace. It is a new and renewed life, and indeed a sacramental gracing of the new life with ever newer life in hyperbolic sense. Christening is raising new life to a higher power of divine newness of life. It is not done through our own power, through our own self-determination. There is our being placed again in the primal porosity between the divine and the creature. This is to be in a sacred betweening where the pouring of water not only purifies, but also offers the life-promising matrix of further life. The waters of christening are not the waters of tohu bohu, nor are they the waters of the flood. They are the chaste signs of pure flowing, pure porosity, opening, so to say, the seeded formlessness of the endowed soul, which is enabled to assume all forms. I mean, primarily the deiformity, DEI formity that is prior to deformity and successor to deformity in a reformed life. Christening also entails the singularity of the human name, but not as a neutral tag which indifferently singles out the indifferently particular item. There is a sign of singularity in the name, in the naming, which calls the one into the intimacy of the universal God. Christening initiates one into a community both intimate and universal at once. The sacred community as the intimate universal. This is a name of a book I wrote some years ago called The Intimate Universal, not the merely abstract universal. There are thinkers, of course, who rebel against the universal in the name of the intimate. But this too can be one-sidedly reactive to the canonization of the abstract universal. Somebody like Lev Shestov, for instance. Okay. No logic of self-determination can do justice to what is at stake in thinking through the meaning of the consecrating power. I'm coming close to the end, turning pages again. Does christening heighten the sense of companioning discussed earlier? Companioning does not allow indifference between the companions. Companioning can be a reconciling power struggling against the temptation to hostility. Companioning is not well expressed in the apartheid of the project of parallel lines. Companioning is not well lived in the struggle for subordination. In companioning, one is made to think literally of friends breaking bread together. Christened, this meal becomes the Eucharist, a festive, sacred meal in which the divine offers and shares itself. Perhaps it is best to think of a kind of agape companioning, a companioning of surplus generosity that makes a way by making way, by opening up, reopening a porosity that might seem like nothing, for there seems to be nothing there in the porosity as such. But the porosity is rather the field of betweening, the intermedium in which and through which pass communications, and originally the divine communication whose creative word is the enabling origin of all that is. We clutter the porosity with the idols of our own fixation. Christening dissolves the fixations, the counterfeit doubles of false gods. It allows the flow of sanctifying grace in the porosity, but we mostly see and feel nothing there. And yet in agape companioning, there is the superior one who travels incognito the way, and the naming of the saving one does not dawn until the breaking of bread. So again, I'm asking myself the question, what would it mean to philosophize in that sense after the so-called death of God? And I'm And I want to finish with an image. I think of the two disciples, and again, think of that by tonum, by two, the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Ruminate on this philosophically after the death of God, though now perhaps it's something of a post-Christian dismay. What might make us turn around and go back to Jerusalem? Christening philosophy. Can the philosopher see himself or herself? Can I see myself with the disciples fleeing from Jerusalem? Hard to justify oneself on this score in advance. After the death of God, there is more than dismay, rather disarray, disorientation after Calvary, the catastrophe of Calvary. The sky darkens, not once, but now it seems forever, and a cloud of night covers the earth, and under it frightened and violent animals rove. An incognito companion walks the way with one as one flees. The companion is mysteriously well versed in scriptural hermeneutics, astonishing in the power of illumination he brings to the words. We are so absorbed in conversation, scriptural and otherwise, we do not stop and ask in arrested astonishment, who is this one? It is only when we come to rest and to the meal that, arrested in more than astonishment, the moment steals the time to unveil the eternal one companioning one in the breaking of the bread. This is the Eucharistic moment enacted and reenacted, and the refugee companions awake to what they now see. This is a moment of christening, perhaps. The companioning now shimmers with a resurrected astonishment, and the words of interpretation have a new charge, a metanoetic charge. The companion vanishes in being recognized, but the response is not dismay or disarray. The companions rather hurry back to Jerusalem, the holy city they have deserted. I thank you for your patience with me.